Greetings, amigops and top teners everywhere. Welcome back to another edition of Top 10 with Kyle and Mike. I am your co-host, Kyle. Opposite me today is your favorite co-host, Michael. He is dancing in a like a hula fashion almost. And he's mixing it up. He's doing all kinds of things as I introduce him. It's fantastic. He's clearly ready to go. As we do every week, this week, one of us has brought a topic to the table, a top 10 list of that topic. This week, Mike did that. I have no idea what the topic is, but as this episode continues, he will relay that list to me. We will vigorously debate it, and by the end of this episode, we will have a definitive version of that top 10 list. So, Michael, what is it that we will be discussing today?
All right, Kyle, thank you for that lovely intro. So I want to be clear up front. This is not a Jerry or Maureen approved podcast, because I mentioned to them yesterday that I was podcasting with you today, and I told them the topic, and they said, haven't you done that before? So this is going to be the 2019 Mike Booker Prizes. So the Man Booker Prize is the highest literary prize awarded to, so they've changed the rules a little bit. I think it used to be just writers from the British Commonwealth and maybe foreign territories. And now it's basically, I think, anybody writing in English is eligible for this prize. So it used to be primarily Irish, English authors, Indian authors, Australian, you get the idea. But now I think it's anybody publishing primarily in the English language is eligible for this award, but it's my favorite literary award, and so I am going to do my 2019 Mike Booker Prize. It's the Man Booker Prize is the actual name.
The Mike Booker Prize.
Yes, and so these are my favorite books I read in 2019.
In English.
In the English language, that is correct. A couple important notes about this. I did not include nonfiction. So these are all fiction books.
Is it usually a fiction award?
Yes, it is an award for fiction. So these are all works of fiction, and they are all either not a part of a series or are like the first book in a series that you don't really have to read in order. There might not even be any of those, but that was my rule. So like, also they're books that I've read for the first time. So
were they books that were published in 2019?
No, absolutely not.
Just books that you read.
The books that I read. So importantly, like I read Clash of Kings this past year, but I've read that before, and it's a part of a series, so it double violates the rules.
But if you had read like Dune this year in anticipation of the movie, that might count because it's technically part of a series. That's a perfect example,
but you don't need to read the others, and it's the first one. That's a great example. I actually did read Dune for the first time this year. It just didn't rate quite highly enough to make my list.
I'm already taking umbrage at this list, but continue.
Yes, but those are the basic rules. So had to be something I read this year, had to be fiction, and can't be like the third book in a series that you've got to read. So them's the rules, and I had to have read it the first time this year.
I love it. I love Mike's book episodes from Mike's bookshelf, because I always walk away with a very long list of books to read. So
yeah, this was a great year of reading. It was also a great year of movies, which I know we'll get to, but like great year for stories. Also good TV. I thoroughly enjoyed the stories that I read, watched, listened to, all that stuff in 2019.
Yeah, I'm glad that it is this embarrassment of content riches that has invaded our ears and eyeballs via television and movies and podcasting has extended into the literary world.
Yeah, 100%. Very good year. I was going to say something. Oh, yeah, I wanted to do a quick plug. So we are not sponsored by Goodreads, but part of this was inspired by the fact that I finally signed up for Goodreads. This is like New Girl, something Caroline had been telling me to get into for a long time, and I had for some reason ignored her, even though all the signs pointed to my quite enjoying it. Finally gave in. Goodreads is the shiz. It's a great way to organize your books, either that you've read or want to read. You can put them in bookshelves, all that stuff. It's great. I love Goodreads.
Since you have recommended it, I have retroactively gone back and tried to fill my read bookshelf with everything I've read, which is a fun exercise.
Yeah.
And now I've got a long list of places, or I've got a place where I can keep organized the long list of things that I would like to read. So
yeah, I want to make one quick process note for 2020, something I did not do in 2019 and which I regretted. Make sure if you're using the Goodreads app to log when you start and finish your books, because if you do that, you get a year in review at the end of the year. That's really cool. If you do not, and you just put it on a custom 2019 bookshelf like I did, you don't get that thing at the end of the year because it doesn't actually know when you read them.
Good
so
point.
Make sure you're logging when you read, because at the end it gives you your longest book, shortest book, most popular book, least popular book, average rating, average pages, all kinds of cool stuff. It's just actually a really neat thing. So Nicole sent me hers, my sister, and her year was really cool. Just very fun to see.
I will make sure that I'm doing that. I don't know if I'm doing that.
Yeah,
I'd like to see yours.
Not been.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Great tip.
So them's the tips. That's the dealio. Shall I get started?
I would love for you to get started.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is tell you the name of the book, the author. I'm going to read, if it's appropriate in that it's not too long, like the Goodreads synopsis, and then just kind of give some general thoughts about what I was reading.
Okay.
All right, so number 10 is actually a book that you got me, I want to say for Christmas of 2018. It may have been my birthday, but it was one that I had on my shelf for a while, because it's an old-ass book, bad cover, all that stuff. Just the kind of formula to get stuck in your shelf for a while, because it doesn't ever catch your eye. And then I finally read it, and I absolutely loved it. Number 10 is King Rat by James Clavell.
Clavell, I don't know how it's pronounced.
Yeah, I don't know. So let me just give you the quick Goodreads. So, the time is World War II. The place is a brutal prison camp deep in Japanese-occupied territory. Here, within the seething mass of humanity, one man, an American corporal, seeks dominance over both captives and captors alike. His weapons are human courage, unblinking understanding of human weaknesses, and total willingness to exploit every opportunity to enlarge his power and corrupt or destroy anyone who stands in his path.
That's an interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts because I find it interesting too.
That's not. It makes it sound like this is Game of Thrones in a prison camp.
Yeah.
Which I haven't read this book in a long time, but that's not how I remember it. I remember it more as like the story of a plucky American who like through his ingenuity and likability like manages to get everybody in the camp to like him. Am I remembering that incorrectly, or is he just a real conniving son of a bitch?
Well, so that's sort of an interesting thing. The book itself doesn't pose that question like explicitly, but I think very nicely implies it throughout the book. So basically this guy, he sells cigarettes, he finds extra eggs, he trades people favors, he gets radios, he's kind of involved in whatever prison trade there is. Yeah. Yes, he is red. So he's basically supplying all this stuff. He's got all of the camp guards wrapped around his finger. It's a lot like Lord of the Flies in that it's a study of what happens when people's circumstances change very, very strongly. So it's really interesting because it feels like an outdated book in that, you know, you're looking at it and you're like, oh, all the good guys are these British and Americans and all the bad guys are the Japanese. It's actually not presented that way. The book is actually very sensitive to sort of the confusion of war and the way that people's circumstances dictate their behavior. I was very surprised by how sensitive and thoughtful the book was. And I think it does a really nice job of showing this character's behavior and the behavior of all the people around him and letting you judge for yourself.
Well, it's interesting because, like you said, like the one of the villains in the book is another POW that is like out to get our guy, and a lot of the guards are portrayed as, you know, like amenable to his cause. And I haven't read this since I was like literally in elementary school. Like this is one of the first books I read that was a longer like novel type book, and I remember just really loving it.
Just an incredible thing to a picture.
I don't know why I read King. My dad loves this author, and he's read a lot of his stuff, so he must have given it to me. But
Yeah.
I'm glad that you read it and enjoyed it.
Yeah, really great book. So that was number 10. So number 9. Number 9 is a book called Washington Black by Essie Adugian. So, yes, this book, I'll give you the, it's a little bit long. We'll see how it goes. Washington Black is an 11-year-old field slave who knows no other life than the Barbados sugar plantation where he was born. When his master's eccentric brother chooses him to be his manservant, Wash is terrified of the cruelties he is certain await him. But Christopher Wilde, or Titch, is a naturalist, explorer, scientist, inventor, and abolitionist. He initiates Wash into a world where a flying machine can carry a man across the sky, where two people, separated by an impossible divide, might begin to see each other as human, and where a boy born in chains can embrace a life of dignity and meaning. But when a man is killed and a bounty is placed on Wash's head, Titch abandons everything to save him. And then there's a bunch more. But basically, it's the story of this young slave who ends up crossing the world with his master's brother, who is, like they say, he's a naturalist and an explorer, and he's just kind of a kook. He's like, he could be from around the world in 80 days. And
I was just gonna say it's Around the World in 80 Days meets Schindler's List.
Yeah, so it's basically just the two of them just traveling the world. And what's interesting is it's a cool setup. Like it's just, I think, a very neat way of getting the perspective of a young boy into this sort of story, which is, I think, a little bit difficult to do. And so it's a cool setup. It's very different. The end falls apart a little bit. I think the third act was a little bit meh, but the first 2/3 of this book were kind of bordering on perfection, like really well written. The observation that I shared with our friend Shelby that really sticks with me is that it was a book that I could not have read. Could not have written. It was a book where I felt these observations, because the author is not white, and the author, I think, identifies with the experiences of being black in a world that, surrounded by white people. And there were just these observations that I could not have made. Like, yes, I could observe, and I think probably, assuming I were a good writer, that slavery is bad. It is not fun to work all day in the fields. Like, those are sorts of things that, I could figure that out. But the actual feeling of being in a world where people treat you so differently is just not something I could capture in quite the way that this author did. And that was what really struck me, is it was just observed so beautifully. There were things that this young boy was feeling that really struck home with me, but which I never would have come up with on my own. And that was like the lasting experience for me, is the way he sees the world and the interactions he has, and the way he's so not confused, because he's a very smart young boy, but just struck by the way people treat him, and the way he sort of observes those is like, hey, that's just the way the world is, but clearly it shouldn't be. It's pretty amazing. And there was one point where he's with this guy Titch, and he realizes that Titch could just ditch him, and really nothing would change in this guy's life, but he would end up going back to a plantation and work as a slave the rest of his life. And even though he knows this guy wouldn't do that, the very fact that he could completely F's up their relationship. And that was one of those observations that just would never have struck me. But it was like, it really sticks with me. Like that feeling of, even though I know this person will not abuse their power over me, they have it.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen that in something else, but I can't put my finger on it. But you're right. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to happen for it to be a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. What's the vibe of this book? Because like Around the World, and it sounds kind of goofy, but also like dealing with some pretty heady subject material. Like, what's the vibe?
That is the vibe. It's goofy and kind of fun and light, and then all of a sudden something happens, and even if that something isn't that big, and the book interestingly avoids like crazy big confrontations for the most part. Like you keep expecting these big crazy things to happen and they kind of don't. But it's just like goofy thing, you know, they're doing some stuff and cataloging some mollusks, and then all of a sudden just some piece of you know, antebellum life intrudes in their lives, and you're like, oh, this isn't just a story of this kid and this brilliant inventor just having a grand old time. That can't be the story, because that's not the world they live in. And that's sort of the way the book functions, is that it's like fun little side adventure. But
there's
it's
like...
really well done.
Okay, cool. That sounds fun. Well, not fun.
Yeah, but it
like
was. Was. But that's the thing, though. It is. It doesn't. I don't think it's an interesting book because that it doesn't gloss over life at this time, but it also doesn't whack you over the head with it. It just tells you a story, and a inextricable part of that story is that this child is a slave.
There are a lot of stories about this time, right? Because it's such an important time, and so to have something like this that is a little bit off of the normal kind of trajectory we get for a story like this, I think is interesting.
100%. And the next one is another good example of that. So we'll transition to that. The Holocaust. The Holocaust is a topic and a time that has been written about endlessly. And so, you know, to write a book about the Holocaust that people are going to be interested in reading, you have to attack it through some sort of angle. And the angle that the Holocaust was bad is not a particularly interesting angle. It's accurate, obviously, and it's important that we all be reminded of that. But, you know, ultimately books are only books only work if people read them. And so you have to pull people in to get them to read them. So this next one is a book called Fatherland, by an author named Robert Harris, who I may have mentioned on this podcast before. He's one of my favorites. He writes a lot of historical fiction. So I think this is the third or fourth book I've read by him. So he wrote a book called Pompeii about an engineer who maintains the aqueducts in Pompeii and starts to notice things are wrong. And there's like a Jaws-like conspiracy to keep that out of the public eye.
You mentioned that book.
Yeah, I think you would quite like that one. There's one called Officer and a Spy, and it's about the Dreyfus affair, and I think it's about the guy who's investigating him. This one is called Fatherland, and I'll read the synopsis, but it's basically about a municipal police officer during the Third Reich. And it's interesting because he's different than you expect, and it sets the story up nicely because of that. So I'll read the synopsis. It is 20 years after Nazi Germany's triumphant victory in World War II, and the entire country is preparing for the grand celebration of the Führer's 75th birthday, as well as the imminent peacemaking visit from President Kennedy. That's Joseph Kennedy, importantly. Meanwhile, Berlin detective Xavier March, a disillusioned but talented investigator of a I don't know, that's written really weirdly. Corpse washes up on the lake. When a dead man turns out to be a high-ranking Nazi commander, the Gestapo orders March off the case immediately. Suddenly, other unrelated deaths are anything but routine. Now obsessed by the case, March teams up with a beautiful young American journalist and starts asking questions, dangerous questions. What they uncover is a terrifying and long-concealed conspiracy of such astounding and mind-numbing terror that it is certain to spell the end of the Third Reich if they can live long enough to tell the world about it.
Wow, that is not where I thought this was going.
Yes, so basically, the story is that there's this dead person who turns up and they realize that he's a Nazi official, and then there's these other deaths that kind of come together, and it basically is a conspiracy that would cause big problems for Nazi Germany that has now reached respectability in the world community. So President Joseph Kennedy, so that's JFK's father, and he was well known for it would depend on who you ask how they would describe it, a non-interventionist stance to the problems in Europe. Some people would call him an appeaser. Some might even say sympathizer. There's a range of opinions on that. I don't have enough, background to call that. But basically, he becomes the president and is going to welcome the Nazis back into the world community. And this revelation would cause serious problems. What I think is cool about this is it presents an alternate history, which is a pretty common technique that people employ. The Man in the High Castle is a pretty, well-known example of this particular counterfactual. But the book does something different, which is it doesn't actually dwell on that. Like, the point of the book is not, hey, the Nazis won the war. It's, okay, that's the setup. And then you just have this particular story that takes place within that. And because it doesn't dwell on that fact, and it slowly reveals sort of the way the world functions as they've won the war, it's very, very different than you would anticipate. Because it's not overbearing in the story.
Sometimes when you have something like that, the focus can be on, oh, what are all the things that changed then? Like in an alternate history. Especially in stories where like the history gets revised mid-story, and so you have like a before and after. So that's interesting. I was gonna say this reminds me of it sounds like Child 44, where like someone is trying to solve a mystery, but like
That's
the government
exactly what it's like.
So the government is fighting back and like actively doesn't want you to solve it, even though you're a part of that system.
Yep.
So
wow, I had not connected that. I love Child 44. It's very similar to Child 44.
Yeah, Child 44, for those of you who are interested, because I would recommend it. It's quite good. It's a guy who he's like a detective in like Soviet Russia, and all these kids start dying, and he realizes that there's a connection, but like the government doesn't want to acknowledge that there could be someone murdering kids because it's against their claim that there's no crime in a communist country. The point being, it sounds like the same kind of setup where like you start to notice something fishy, but your own government doesn't want you to kind of get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. And the book is very claustrophobic, as you have this gigantic, powerful government that's closing in around you on all sides. And the book just does such a great job of capturing that dynamic. But what I think is cool is it's educational in that it gives you a kind of a cool overview of the various government departments in Nazi Germany and how they interacted with each other, and how our sort of mental association with certain of them is stronger than with others. And like, this guy is a city police officer, and we don't need to dive too far down this rabbit hole, but the book doesn't just say, hey, there's Nazis and everybody else. It presents the shades very well. Like, the city, like a city murder police officer is not a functionary in the Nazi government. He's just a police officer. And yes, there are a lot of his colleagues who are very pro-Nazi, but that's not exactly, like, he's not employed as a part of that state apparatus. And so the way he interacts with people who are more strongly for the party is very interesting, kind of different than the way I think we sort of imagine it. And so I think that's part of what's really cool about this too, is it does a nice job of showing you how you get from point A to point B. Point A being like sort of a country that is a somewhat reasonable part of the international community, to country where the atrocities of the Holocaust could happen, and sort of how the various people within that would get from point A to point B. It's very well done. Well,
I'm very interested.
Yeah, I particularly think for you, this would be maybe the one I would recommend the most highly on this list for you.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that was the deal. I'm going to do my honorables, my not tops. I'll do my honorables later. So before I do my not tops, I'm going to need somebody to intro me.
Kevin, hit that stanky beat.
Oh my gosh. Wow. I'm going to need a clothespin to just block out that stank. That is some serious stank up in this building.
I almost wish I were fighting a cold just to prevent the stank from entering my nostrils in the way that they have just now.
Totally agreed. I'm going to buzz through this because these are books that I didn't like. Number one is a book that I inflicted upon you. I loved the cover, caught it at a cool bookstore, really thought you might like it. Partially because it reminded me of the Ted Chiang short stories you had gotten me. My goodness, what is not yours is not yours, or what is yours is not yours. I don't even care enough to remember the title of this book, by Helen Oyeyemi. It was a collection of short stories about half of which were terrible. The other half were fine, but super confusing, and the other half sucked.
I think that I'm being serious. I don't think I have the required understanding to appreciate most of the short stories in this book. Like,
I'm
I
not
really
sure
think
who does, though, Kyle. In all seriousness, who has the required stuff? Her, the author, clearly. Her mom? I don't know who would have understood what was happening in these stories.
They were extremely confusing. There were like 2 or 3 that I really loved, actually.
Yes, you and I discussed just a couple. I forget there was one that you and I agreed we both really liked. It was the one about the interview, right? Like, there was the celebrity who was being interviewed.
Mm-hmm. That was a good one.
Yeah.
Or the one where, like, the husband and wife are, like, doing that weird drug experiment where they,
we liked that.
Cool, but you're right. This wasn't. I should say I'm extremely glad that I read it because there were a couple of things in it that I really enjoyed. Like, for example, part of why it's so confusing is that she uses pronouns like very, very fluidly, and like most of her characters are non-binary or like. There's some like, so it was hard to piece together. It made me realize how often we rely on the gender of pronouns to figure out things about our characters.
And maybe this was the point.
I think it probably was. And, but it was also extremely hard to read. So give and take. But I'm glad that I read it.
I would agree. It was, if nothing else, a good reminder that I love the format. I really enjoy the short story collection, which I know you're partial to, and I like it too. This was not my favorite collection. So that was one of my least favorites. This one was probably not like, from a technical point of view, the worst book of the year, but just a very disappointing book. It's a book called Swing Time by Zadie Smith. So Zadie Smith is a very well-known author. She may have won the Pulitzer Prize for a book called White Teeth. She's just a really good writer. That there's really not much more other than she's an excellent fiction writer. She tends to focus on minority communities and their, struggles, and she's a really good writer. Swing Time sucked butts. It was about these 2 childhood friends, and they basically drift apart. And I just didn't like it, and it was a bummer, because I think that this woman is a very talented writer. I just sometimes think she's writing bad things, and this was bad. It was basically just a very hollow reflection of the really good work she had done on White Teeth. It was a lot like that book, but without any of the real flair,
I think I get what you mean. This is like maybe not quite the right analogy since I haven't read them, but it feels like a Casual Vacancy versus the Cormoran Strike thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great example. It's like...
Not necessarily the Harry Potter stuff, but like the... Yeah,
you're like... It actually is not a bad comparison to say Casual Vacancy to Harry Potter, where you're like... I see that she's trying to do some of the same stuff she did really well, where you're like combining serious stuff with humor, but you just missed this one. You missed the mark here.
It happens. It does happen.
But so that was a misfire. It was a bit of a bummer. And then the last one was one that was a real bummer because I got it at my favorite book stall in London. It was like I was romantically remembering my days as a study abroad student. Like, I shall go to my old book stall, and it was a beautiful cover. It was a book called Between the Assassinations by Aravind Adiga. He had won, I think, a Man Booker Prize for another book. Not this one. Which as it turns out, was a rejected manuscript that he wrote before that one. And then he basically got the power to get anything published because he had won that prize. And I say anything because this stunk. It basically took place, I think, I want to say in like the 70s or 80s in India. And that's about all I can tell you about it because it was just a bunch of vignettes about loosely connected characters that it just stunk. Again, like technically proficient, fine. Nothing wrong with the subject matter. Could have been good, just wasn't. Bad. Oh. But it was a real bummer. Not a good book.
That's too bad. That. Like that's much worse than a book that's bad because the writing is good, but it's just the setup is uninteresting.
Yeah.
Like, it's worse if you're like, oh, this could be awesome, and then it's just not.
Yep. Yep. Not good. Not good.
Shame.
Now, number 7, so we're going to go back to the tops. Number 7 is basically the same concept as that book, except that the characters are connected. It's really just one character, but it's just a bunch of vignettes that don't clearly connect one to the next, but that really tell a great story. So this one is called Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. So I think this one won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was adapted into a, I believe, miniseries, I think starring Frances McDormand. I could have made all that up. It might be a movie starring somebody else, but I think it was a miniseries starring Frances McDormand. And it's basically just this woman in a small New England town, and it just tells you stories of her life. Like, most of the stories are probably 5 to 15 pages. Like, oh, hey, that time she went to her son's wedding, and that's it. And then, hey, that time that she got into a car accident. Oh, that time she met some pregnant girl in a diner and learned about her life. And it's just these short stories of her interacting with the people in her life. Like, her husband gets Alzheimer's, and it's just her going to visit him at the home. And it's just these really well-observed, slow, but just really well written. It's slow. I'm not going to sell you this one like Fatherland. It's not a thrill a minute. But it tells a really interesting story of this woman. I think it provides a pretty complete portrait of her in a way that a linear, traditional A to B story wouldn't. I think it's cool that you get to have this woman, Olive, interact with the different people in her life, either her close family members and friends, or just random people in a variety of situations that are not connected, and just see how she behaves.
Is it chronological, or does it kind of go all over the place?
That's it. I actually can't tell you for sure. My recollection is that it's chronological, though I think there's some where she's like deeply remembering, and it's like Olive took a sip of her tea, and then it's like back 50 years. But my recollection is it's roughly in chronological order.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, really good stuff. Again, not a thriller, but really just if you like good writing and you like short stories, I would not be surprised if you quite like this one.
We should have been doing this the whole time. Where did you find this book, and why did this book come into your field of vision? Like, why did you end up reading this?
All right, let me go through the list real quick. King Rat, you gave it to me and have been praising it for a long time. Washington Black was on a list, I want to say of 2017. It may have been published in 16. But it was a couple years ago. It was on a lot of like best of the year lists. Fatherland was just one that I found because I love that author, Robert Harris. Olive Kitteridge was interesting. This is a couple books I've read recently fall into this category. When we moved my parents out of my parents' house, there were a lot of books just laying around that like my sisters had read or my parents had read or that were assigned in school, and I just decided I was going to pick through them and see if there were any I thought looked good. And this one looked good to me.
That's cool. I'm glad I asked.
Yep. So, good book. Very, very enjoyable. Number 6 was a book called The Moor's Account. Oh, I didn't read the synopsis on that one. We'll skip it. But number 6 is The Moor's Account by Layla Lalami.
Great name.
This one, yeah, it's a beautiful name, isn't it? This was a book that I found at the Harvard book sale. So there's it's actually really cool. They have Cambridge book sale. I never remember whether it's actually associated with Harvard. I think it is. It's wait a second. I heard somebody in the background. What was that?
It's not affiliated with the university. It's just called Harvard Bookstore because it's in Harvard Square.
Oh, thank you so much. Great.
Wow.
Great weigh in from the crowd. So Caroline, for the listeners who probably couldn't hear that, said it is in Harvard Square, but not affiliated with the university.
I heard that loud and clear. I bet that got picked up.
Wow. Oh, beautiful. Nice work, Caroline. Really adding value. So
yeah,
maybe
you should just go.
Yeah, I'll probably just leave. They do. I want to say like probably quarterly, a couple times a year they do a book sale. I actually took Quinn and Emma to it. It may have been when I bought this, and they have this really cool book sale in a warehouse, and it's a little claustrophobic. That's the only thing I don't like about it. Is it's always packed. They announce it on their Facebook page, and my friend Shelby's always good about telling me it's happening. And I legitimately leave that book sale a couple times a year with 6 or 7 books, all mostly new, like almost always new. And I probably spent $25. Like, I don't.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it's cool because it's books that I would not have found otherwise because they're typically published a couple of years before. That's why they put them on sale like that. It's an interesting strategy. It's a good way of getting rid of their back catalog, because I think a lot of bookstores don't do that. They continue to charge a high price for a book that was published 6 years ago, and that's never going to sell.
Well, also, like, now you go to that bookstore 4 times a year. I'd imagine you probably go there other times a year now, too, just because you've been there. That's genius.
Yeah, it's genius stuff. So I saw this book, was very struck by it, I think with Quinn and Emma, actually. So I'll read you the synopsis. In 1527, the conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez sailed from the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda with a crew of 600 men and nearly 100 horses. His goal was to claim what is now the Gulf Coast of the United States for the Spanish crown, and in the process become as wealthy and famous as Hernán Cortés. But from the moment the Narvaez expedition landed in Florida, it faced peril, navigational errors, disease, starvation, as well as resistance from indigenous tribes. Within a year, there were only 4 survivors. The expedition's treasurer, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, a Spanish nobleman named Alonso de Castillo Maldonado, a young explorer named Andrés Dorantes de Carranza, and Dorantes' Moroccan slave Mustafa Alzamori, whom the 3 Spaniards called Este Bianco. These 4 survivors would go on to make a journey across America that would transform them from proud conquistadores to humble servants, from fearful outcasts to faith healers. So basically, it's an expedition to the United States that goes very wrong. It's not the United States, obviously, at this time. It's the New World. And they end up in Florida, and things just go very wrong. And it's primarily focused on that character, Este Bianco, who is this Moroccan slave. He was not born a slave and sold himself into slavery to help his family. I think he had a sick brother, if I'm remembering right. And so he's a very educated guy, and he ends up, his whole life changes because he had grown up in a world where he was fairly well off, and he lived a comfortable life, and he becomes a slave, and he ends up exploring this new world. And kind of similar to the Washington Black story, it observes a lot of things about the dynamics between people. But what's cool about this is that the circumstances of all these characters change several times, where they kind of go from, hey, these are the conquistadores and he's the slave, to, hey, they're all equals, to, hey, actually, he's the only one who can help them survive in XYZ scenario, to, hey, they're conquering heroes and now he's just a slave again. And you follow the ways that these people interact with each other and how dependent those interactions are on the circumstances they're in. And it's a really, like, well-observed portrait of people's relationships. I think it was beautifully written. It's quick. I don't remember how many pages it was, like 300 pages, and it tells a beautiful story. This character is just fascinating. He's very still and very quiet, but you still get a lot of his personality. Beautiful, really beautiful story. It's like a little bit of Uncharted, a little bit of, 12 Years a Slave. It's just...
I was going to say, it sounds like The Lost City of Z crossed with, like, Benito Sereno.
Yes, that's a great example. It's really, it does a cool job of exploiting the setting for interest without exploiting the setting. Really, really well done. Great book. I kept reading it and be like, I just really love this book. I just had a smile on my face the whole time because it was just so well done.
Excellent.
Yeah, great book. I think another one I think you would quite like.
Okay.
All right, number 5. It's one of those books that's a little bit harder to describe why it was so good until you read it, but it's a very famous book. It's If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. So considered a masterpiece of American literature. It was actually made into a movie about a year ago or 2 years ago by Barry Jenkins, the guy who directed Moonlight. Mm-hmm. And the synopsis really isn't going to tell that much, but basically the story here is that this young black woman named Tish is in love with Fonnie, who is wrongly accused of a crime and is in jail awaiting trial. And it just kind of tells the story of Tish, who's pregnant, is very important. It tells the story of Tish navigating being pregnant without the love of her life and trying to get him out of jail. That's it. The story is really no more interesting than that. It's just so beautifully written. It hurts. It's so beautiful. It's so perfectly written. I had never read any James Baldwin before. I had a friend, Mark, in college who loved James Baldwin and was telling me to read his stuff, and as these things happen, I just didn't, and then finally did, and just blown away. Like, there's no great story. It's just beautiful writing.
Well, sometimes that's the best kind of book. Have you seen the movie, or had you seen it before you read this?
No, I have not seen the movie, and I'm pumped because Moonlight, I was thinking about lists that we might do, and I was thinking about, like, what are the best movies I've seen in the last decade? Like, what are my 2010s movies? And Moonlight would be pretty close to the top of that. That movie blew me away.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So highly, highly recommended. It's a good opportunity to cross off a snooty masterpiece that's actually really good. So put this on your list if you want to get street cred with the intelligentsia for having read something fancy, but also really good. So that's a good pro tip.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So number 4 is a book that I actually now don't remember if you read it. I know you saw the movie. I think you read it, but I'm not 100% sure. Number 4, a book that I'd been wanting to read for a while. Then it got made into a movie, and that motivated me to see it. The Sisters Brothers by Patrick DeWitt. So you didn't read it, or you did? You're shaking your head a little.
I have not read it, unfortunately. I'm drowning under an avalanche of books that have been given to me that I just need to read, and so, like, a lot of this was on my list for a long time when the movie came out, and I have not read it yet. But
okay, so Sisters Brothers, do you want to give a brief synopsis? It'll probably be more interesting than whatever Goodreads has to say.
Well, I can tell you that the movie is about these two brothers whose surname is Sisters. They're the Sisters Brothers, and they're just like, they're not hitmen, but they're just like tough guys for hire.
They're like Mike from Breaking Bad. They're like kind of like
fixers,
henchman fixer types.
But they're not even like fixers because they're not like that. They're not like super intelligent. Like, they're just kind of muscle.
Yeah.
But they are. Well, one of them in the movie is John C. Reilly, and he's like a pretty sensitive guy, and the other is Joaquin Phoenix, and which, by the way, those two are like maybe two of the best that we have. But anyways,
like and John C. Reilly, importantly, I'm guessing, and I'm not guessing, it was the case in the movie, but both the movie and the book, he's kind of your main focus. Yeah. He's our avatar as the audience.
That's interesting because I think it's less. You've seen the movie or no? I
have.
Yeah, I would say it's less apparent in the movie that he's like our primary focus. But the point is, it's kind of interesting because there is kind of like an overarching plot, kind of, but it's
sort of. There's something about like glowing gold, which was weird.
There's one job that kind of like takes a bigger role in the story, but it's not very plot driven, and it's kind of like it's interesting because it's unclear why the book starts when it does, and like there's not a super well defined ending to it, and so like it's just kind of like a swath of these guys' life, and that's all it is. It's just kind of like their goings on, and I love the movie, and I intend to read the book. So
yeah, that's a perfect encapsulation of kind of the mood, and like the sort of arbitrary beginning and ending is very accurate. It's I think I'm noticing that I was drawn this year, at least, to just like tales of people's lives that didn't necessarily have an overarching structure to them. Not in all cases, but in a couple cases here, I really enjoyed that. And this was a good example of that. Like, you could have probably written this more like Olive Kitteridge or like that book Between the Assassinations where you just picked episodes. That really was how this functioned. It just wasn't as explicit that it's like, hey, this is the part where one of the sisters' brothers gets bitten by a spider. Hey, this is the one where the horse dies. But that's really how it works. The book is a lot like the movie. It's funny. It's stripped down. It's really well written. It's just brief and sharp. Just It's just a good book. I really quite enjoyed it. It's a lot. If you like Mark Twain, or you like Charles Portis, or Leonard Elmore, the guy who wrote Rum Punch, which is Jackie Brown. Like, if you like those sorts of just a story, it's quick, it hits you. True Grit. Charles Portis wrote True Grit. It's a lot like those. It's really good.
Okay. Yeah, this is on my list anyways, but it's vaulting up.
Highly recommend.
Are you saying it's short enough that I could like? Sometimes I'll do this. So I'll read something shorter and a little snappier between two books that like I know are going to take me a while, just to kind of cleanse my palate.
That's typically what I do. Like, I specifically do that. I can actually, if you like, because we are going to see each other, I can bring it for you. The internet is telling me that it was 328 pages. That is not my recollection. I mean, I'm sure the internet is right and I'm wrong. But if you had asked me...
It doesn't feel that way, though, yeah.
If you had asked me, I would have said it was 180 to 210 pages. It was quick. I read it in Italy, and I just zipped through it.
Okay.
So
excellent.
I can loan that to you. It will go on my list of books that I'm loaning you. Yeah.
I think... Well, it doesn't really matter. Once is too many. I think I've only ever lost Thrones for you, right?
Yeah, no, you're fine. You're a good borrower. Plus, the joy I get from having you read a book that I like is enough. Like, that's worth the $3 loss.
Okay.
All right, so that brings us to the honorables. For honorables, I'm just going to do my favorite nonfiction of the year. So I'm going to give you my 4 favorite nonfiction books of the year. So, number 4, I don't know what direction this goes in. You know what? I'm going to order this real quick. So, number 4 is Manhood for Amateurs by Michael Chabon. So, Michael Chabon is an author that you and I both quite like. He is the author of The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. His credentials as a wordsmith are unimpeachable. The man can write a beautiful sentence.
Yeah, you keep going. We don't have time to gush about the way that he's structured. Like, literally just the way he structures sentences and the words that he chooses to use it's strangely unique to him. He's incredible, but
he makes a dragon want to retire, man. He wrote Uptown Funk. Like, that's really all you need to know. The man is he's a hell of a writer. And Uptown Funk, I think, is actually a good access point because it proves that you can apply his skills to really any medium. And he writes nonfiction / memoir really well. So this is basically just a collection of stories from his life that talk about what it is to be a man, in his opinion, and sort of what his experience of being a brother, a son, a father, a boyfriend, all those things, what it is to him. And it's just great. Like, he talks about picking toys for his kids and thinking about like what kind of toys he should get for them. He talks about like dating people and the struggles he had with dating people. He talks about the opening story is actually him starting I think as a comic book club as like a nerdy kid, and literally nobody comes. His mom rents out a room at a rec center and nobody comes. No. Yeah, it's incredible. It's just funny. It's really well written. If you like Michael Chabon, it's great. So, Manhood for Amateurs. I got it for Steve as a Christmas present, and then he gave it back to me, so I read it. Number 3 was a book that got a lot of press a couple years ago. It's I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. She was a true crime writer her website was True Crime Diaries or something. It was a very famous blog from the early days of the true crime internet. She's revered as like the queen of true crime. She married Patton Oswalt and then tragically died a couple years ago. Also a Notre Dame graduate. So a lot of things to recommend her. And it's the story of the Golden State Killer, who you probably heard in the news a couple years ago was captured through the use of, I think it was 23andMe, but whatever. It was one of those genealogical sites. And so she actually passed before the case was solved. But this is her logbook over the course of years of figuring out what happened. And she is a remarkable investigator who actually at several points in the story sketches a character who ends up resembling the actual killer. And it's pretty stunning because nobody knew who the hell did it. Like, this really was a shock when they found out who did it. And she gets pretty close. So it's great. I read this mostly in a day at Notre Dame when I was there for the career fair, and you guys are going to be running the Holy Half Marathon. And I had checked out of my hotel room, and I checked out whatever time people check out of a hotel room, like 10 a.m., and nobody really arrived until like 10 p.m. So I was just alone in the student center with like all of my luggage for like 12 hours, and I read this book. So that was great. Number 2 is a book that I think you would quite like, called The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. It's about this fly fisherman who ends up stealing millions of dollars worth of rare feathers from a museum in the UK, because there are certain traditional flies that can only be tied using these rare birds of paradise. And so he steals all of these feathers, and they sell for like $50 a feather. And it's the story of this gigantic theft of feathers, and it traces how this particular naturalist discovered these birds, discovered in the sense that he was the first colonist to see them. And he catalogs these birds, and he starts this museum, and then this guy, just a couple years ago, stole all of these feathers. It's fascinating and great.
Wow, that sounds like a good fiction story. It makes me even happier that it's not.
It sure does. And that's another one that was really quick and just really well written. Quite enjoyed that one. I think you would too.
Okay.
And the number one, the best nonfiction book I read of the year is the same as many, many people's, because it was so good. Educated by Tara Westover. So it's the story of a girl who is raised in sort of a fundamentalist religious sect I think she was in Idaho was where she was born. And in addition to the sort of religious beliefs of her family, her father has pretty radical anti-government views. And so she basically grows up off the grid and eventually finds herself as a professor at Harvard. And it's just the story of how she got there. It was on most people's best lists, and there's a reason.
Yeah, I feel like this one had got a lot of press. I remember when you read it, we talked about it, and you were raving about it. So
yeah, so that was the best nonfiction I read this past year.
Fantastic.
All right, I'm in my top 3. You ready for it, dog?
Let's get it.
These top 3 are going to be probably 3 of my favorite books for a long time, like real classics for me. So number 3 is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. So Pachinko is importantly it's a Korean gambling game. It's like Keno. It's just like a parlor game that people play. So that's what that means. It doesn't come into the story until a little bit later. I think they probably could have named this story anything. But I will read you the synopsis on Goodreads. In the early 1900s, teenage Sunja, the adored daughter of a crippled fisherman, falls for a wealthy stranger at the seashore near her home in Korea. He promises her the world, but when she discovers she is pregnant and that her lover is married, she refuses to be bought. Instead, she accepts an offer of marriage from a gentle, sickly minister passing through on his way to Japan. But her decision to abandon her home and to reject her son's powerful father sets off a dramatic saga that will echo down through the generations. Richly told and profoundly moving, Pachinko is a story of love, sacrifice, ambition, and loyalty. From bustling street markets to the halls of Japan's finest universities to the pachinko parlors of the criminal underworld, Lee's complex and passionate characters, strong, stubborn women, devoted sisters and sons, fathers shaken by moral crisis, survive and thrive against the indifferent arc of history. So this falls into a category of book that Caroline and I have been kicking around a list for a while here called intergenerational family epics. That's what we have termed this genre. We've agreed this is our favorite genre. It's typically a story that is specific to a time and place. It often follows immigrant families, and it just shows the story of a family over the course of 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. That's basically all it is, and it tells you the stories of a whole family, and that was this one. And it was so richly told. It's gorgeous. There's about 10 characters that you really care about by the end of this story. And it's just an epic that is... It's just beautiful. I've recommended this one to pretty much everybody I know who likes to read. Do
you find a lot of books in that genre? Is that like a common
I don't know that anybody has called it that or like circumscribed it.
Yeah,
and
whatever.
I don't want to give away the give away the game because Caroline and I are definitely going to do a list like this. But yes, there are a lot of books like this where, like, I'm trying to think of a good example that isn't going to give anything away, but it typically follows like, hey, this family moved from Iran, Italy, the UK, whatever, and came to the United States, and they started a bakery in New York City, and the daughter got pregnant, and the son joined the army, and it just follows them for years and years. And oh, they don't talk to Uncle Elmer, and it just follows that for a long time.
I don't want to spoil anything because if you've read it, I'm sure this would fit on your list. I'm reading a book right now that kind of fits that, and it's...
You can tell. What's the title?
Have you read Hillbilly Elegy?
No, but
okay. Continue.
I'm familiar with the concept.
Well, I haven't finished it, but it's literally what you're describing, where it starts with these two people in Kentucky, and then it just kind of like traces their lineage through industrial America. And like this is more of a telling of a region and an area, and it's not political, but it reads that way in the current climate. So it's not necessarily it's the telling of like a broader kind of story from the perspective of a single family, which I think might kind of fit into this. But anyways,
that's exactly right. That's exactly what it is, and that's how this story reads. It's fiction, but it's the same kind of deal. It gives you history, and I don't particularly know a ton about Korean history, and so you learn a little bit of that. You learn about just a way of life that I didn't know about, and a family that I find fascinating. So couldn't recommend it more highly. Very long. Doesn't read long, but it's a long book.
Okay, got it.
All right. Number 2. One of my favorite authors, Pat Barker, wrote a book this year called The Silence of the Girls. So this one was on a ton of lists of the best of the year, and it was there for a reason. So I actually am not going to read the synopsis of this one because it's pretty simple. So it's just a retelling of the Iliad, but instead of focusing on the deeds and heroics of the men, it follows the women and the lives that they led during the conflict. And it's fascinating because, all of these men living in these camps on the beach of Troy, they had slaves. They had women who were forced to sleep with them. They had cooks. They had people who cleaned their armor, all this stuff. And those women all had interesting and rich lives that are not told because they're typically not as interesting. And so this has a particular feminist bent to it. But the story itself works even without sort of that particular angle. It follows this woman, Briseis, who is forced to live with Achilles, and it follows his moods and how he is just always clashing with the high command of the Greeks. But he's not an interesting character. And the book does a nice job of painting him as complex, but his goings on are just not that interesting. I'm kind of contradict myself by saying the book does a nice job of exploring him and not making him one-dimensional. But the point is, his great exploits are not nearly as interesting as the struggles of this particular woman. And it does a really interesting job of pointing out the cruelties of the men and the way that they behave towards the women. And what's interesting, and I think really intentional and smartly done, is that the things that make this woman's life hard, while they are informed by this specific conflict in this particular time and place, are very much in place now. The fact that her life is not her own is basically the most difficult thing about her life. And the ways that her life is not her own are ways that in many places, if less so in America these days, still in many places in the world, women's lives are still not their own. And it's the same ways as this woman's life is not her own. And all of that makes it sound like an incredibly depressing story. It's just perfectly done. I think it captures war really beautifully, as most of Pat Barker's work does. She's one of the most talented writers I've ever read. She could write about painting a wall white and it would work. So she manages to make this story not just an endless drudge and depressing. It's beautiful and well done, and it has a lot of cool observations.
That's an interesting angle on it. It's kind of like we were talking about earlier with Fatherland, where it's like an interesting angle into this kind of thing, or an interesting lens. It's kind of interesting how like sometimes in order to like address a modern issue or topic, like doing it in this way actually makes it more accessible, even though it's Achilles. But that's fun. How'd you come across this one?
It was just on a lot of lists, and I was up at a bookstore in New Hampshire, and importantly, Pat Barker is one of my favorite authors. She wrote a trilogy called the Regeneration Trilogy, which I'm sure I've mentioned before. It's about World War One. It's about a mental hospital in World War One. So I just think she's a beautiful writer, and then I just saw it, and I purchased it, and I was very glad I did. So that was a great one. Another one that made all those top lists and deserved very much to be there. Number one, my favorite book of the year, the winner of the 2019 Mike Booker Prize, Normal People by Sally Rooney. So this is a book, you may recognize the cover. It's been everywhere the last couple of years. I think it was published 2018, I want to say. And it made a lot of those best of the year lists. It's by this Irish author, Sally Rooney. And I will read the synopsis here because it's a little bit of a tough one to synopsize, if that's a word. So, at school, Connell and Marianne pretend not to know each other. He's popular and well-adjusted, star of the school soccer team, while she is lonely, proud, and intensely private. But when Connell comes to pick his mother up from her housekeeping job at Marianne's house, a strange and indelible connection grows between the two teenagers, one they are determined to conceal. A year later, they're both studying at Trinity College in Dublin. Marianne has found her feet in a new social world while Connell hangs at the sidelines, shy and uncertain. Throughout their years at college, Marianne and Connell circle one another, straying toward other people and possibilities, but always magnetically, irresistibly drawn back together. Then, as she veers into self-destruction and he begins to search for meaning elsewhere, each must confront how far they're willing to go to save each other. So, basically, it's the story of a popular boy and a not popular girl who fall in love in high school and then can't sort of kick the habit for many years thereafter. And that's a very simplistic way of rendering the story. There's so much more to it. It was like a thriller. I literally couldn't put this book down. I read it until like 11 p.m. one night to finish it, which, as you know,
that's
really like
unheard of.
As stunning an endorsement as I can provide for a book, because I just couldn't put it down.
Just to convert that, so that would be like me or you, listener,
a
staying
normal
up until
person.
That would be like staying up until like 1 a.m. just to read a book on a weeknight.
100%. It was actually a weeknight. I felt this whole time, I felt like somebody was standing on my chest. Like I was so. It was like a thriller, but of the human heart. Like I couldn't wait to find out what was going to happen next in the story of these two people's relationship, because even though I am one half of a very happy and healthy relationship, you can feel all of the things that go into a relationship. And they were so perfectly observed, like the thrill of your first love and the way that it's hard to keep a relationship through time and space. And it just like all those relatable elements dialed up to 100. It was the most perfect book I read this year. It was perfect. Every second of reading was a thrill and sad and happy and beautiful. It was an absolute marvel. An absolute marvel. Best book I read this year, no questions asked. One of the best books I've ever read.
Wow.
And if you hate it, but I want to put one brief caveat on it. If you read this book based on its winning the 2019 Mike Booker Prize and say you hate it, I'll say, yeah, okay, I believe you. Like I could understand hating it, and I wouldn't think you were a fool for hating it.
That's sometimes we've talked about this with movies. Like the best movies are movies that are have a score like a average score, but the standard deviation is extremely wide.
Exactly. And I would imagine you could ask 10 people who have read this, and probably 5 of them would tell you it sucked butts, and the other 5 would tell you it's the best book they've read in the past 5 years. importantly, while this is the Mike Booker prizes, Caroline actually just came into the room and was sitting down and started nodding the whole time. I recommended this to her after I read it, and she did the exact same thing as I did. She just blasted through it and loved every second and has been raving about it for a month or two since she read it.
So statistically, if I read it, I'll probably hate it.
So I know 4 people who have read it. 3 of the 4 thought it was the best book they ever read. 1 of the 4 said that sucked ass.
Okay, cool.
Megan from work. I know. Caroline just said, "Who was it?"
Who? Yeah.
And I don't blame her. I get it. If you didn't like it, I'd be like, yeah, okay. Well,
I could see that. Sure.
Yeah. But
okay.
Couldn't recommend it more highly. Beautiful, brilliant work of art.
This is the blessing and the curse of being friends with you, Mike, is that I have like 9 books that I really want to read directly from you, and it becomes hard to prioritize my reading time. So thank you and fuck you for that.
You're welcome. I want to do a quick, these are the ones Kyle should read. I know I sort of mentioned it as I went. Fatherland is so you. A Sister's Brothers for sure.
Yeah.
You should reread What Is Something Is Not Yours. Just kidding. And I think you should definitely read The Feather Thief.
Okay.
Those would be like, if you came away with this with 3 books, those would be the 3 I think you gotta read.
Well, now I feel like I need to read Normal People too, but understood.
But you're not allowed to come back.
Yeah, Mike!
You wasted my time. That book was terrible.
Yeah, well, you've been caveating it effectively, I think. So
yeah. So you're now not allowed to be mad if you don't like it.
Right, exactly. I'm allowed to not like it. I just can't get mad at you.
Oh yeah, you're very welcome to not like it.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I don't know. Do you want to do any of the Kyle Booker prize, or what do you got?
I was thinking about the books I read this year, and I went back on Goodreads, and you're right. I didn't do what you said I need to, so it's unclear when I finish these books. But I read a lot of good fiction books, I think, last year, and pretty much everything I've read this year that I've really enjoyed has been nonfiction. So I just won't. I guess I could mention them, but obviously Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers, wasn't his best work, but it was interesting and not very cohesive, but its individual parts were very interesting.
What's the concept? I've heard a couple people say they read it, but I guess I haven't explored what it was about.
The concept is that he kind of explores the concept is this. I don't know if you remember the Sandra Bland case where she was pulled over. Yeah. She ended up taking her own life in jail. Mm-hmm. She for like failing to signal with her indicator. So, and on the surface, it sounds wherever you sit on the issue, it sounds kind of cut and dried. Yeah. And the whole point of this book is to kind of delve into like what goes into an interaction like that and the underlying reasons that we have a difficult time interacting with strangers. So it kind of reads like psychology or like behavioral science. Mm-hmm. I think in his mind, it's like a grand overarching like puzzle that kind of comes together at the end, which in reality, I don't think it quite does. But like I said, the individual pieces are very interesting and applicable, I think, on a personal level in some cases. So that's good.
I just want to note just really quickly, it's funny the way you describe sort of the arc of that book, because I'm so familiar with that experience where the discrete parts of a book are really good. The author is totally convinced that they've just redefined a particular topic for you, and you see what they intended to do, but it doesn't quite come together. That is so common, like the way that happens. And it just makes you wonder, like, is this author sharing this with other people before they publish it? Because I totally get what they were trying to do, and they almost did it, but somebody should have told them it didn't quite come together.
Yeah, and like I think it lands. Like it does land. It's just I was expecting the whole time for like a real oomph at the end, and it is just kind of like it. I think if it had been a high school essay, like your teacher would have like circled your conclusion and been like, flesh this out. Like it seems like you just kind of finished it. But anyways, and then 2 books from Jameson, actually, Dead Wake, which reads like fiction because it's Eric Larson.
Eric Larson, this podcast is unapologetically as pro Eric Larson as a podcast can possibly be. He has a new book coming out. Wait, did I tell you he's got a new book coming out?
Nope. That's
Comes out
very
in March.
exciting.
I think March. I already pre-ordered it. It's about Winston Churchill.
Oh,
pew,
great.
Pew, pew, pew.
I was off work for like a month this year, and so I did a lot of reading. So like most days I would ride my bike out far and find a fun place to read, and then I would just read for an hour or two and then bike back. And I did that like
so pure.
I was most of the time I did that I was reading Deadwake, so it has a very, very positive association in my mind. Not fiction, but really good.
Only one thing wrong with Deadwake.
What's that?
It unfortunately gives you more background on Georg von Trapp's activities during World War One.
Yeah.
Not great. I always assumed he fought honorably on the Western Front.
Tough luck for
Tough
my
luck
guy.
for our guy Georg. Aim for the civilian boats, Von Trapp.
Tough stuff.
Tough stuff.
And the last one I'll mention is Astro Ball, which I'm glad that I waited until the end of this year to read because of all of this shit that's gone on with the Astros. Do not read this book unless you are a big baseball nerd. But if you are a big baseball nerd, then you will really enjoy it.
What's this one all about? And who wrote it?
Astro Ball was written by, I don't remember his name, but he was like one of the like beat reporters for the Astros, and I think he works for
Ben Ryder.
Yeah, he either does or did work for Sports Illustrated. And it's Moneyball. It's branded like it's Moneyball. And it kind of is. It's like this, if you're into baseball at all, you know that the last 10 years or so have ushered in this wave of analytics and kind of analyzing the game through statistics and data. And it's chronological. It basically follows like from when the Astros hired Jeff Lunau to kind of like revitalize their basically the entire system. And so they hired him in like 2013 or 14 or something. And then it goes all the way up through their 2017 World Series.
So it does not cover the cheating or the Taubman shit?
It's really, really interesting to read through that lens. Especially because they have the focus of the book is how they are trying to blend like data with like their scouts, and the Astros have since fired all of their scouts. But I think it's actually better to read it from knowing what we know now. But very interesting if you're into baseball. I can lend that one. I have it here when we can swap. But anyways, I took a long time to talk about 3 books that are not even fiction and therefore not eligible. But those are some of the highlights of my reading year.
Beautiful. I love it, dog. I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm excited for another great year of reading. I've got a good list piled up. I've already read a couple good ones so far this year, and I'm excited to keep buzzing with Goodreads and logging my dates.
Can I talk about one more book that I think would apply to almost nobody? But
this would
if you're interested, I read a book called No One at the Wheel, which is basically just it's not even that well written of a book. It's like just a lot of data, but it is all about autonomy and where that industry of self-driving cars is going. And if that's something if it's something that you have thought about at all, this is a good book, not in the sense that it's like a riveting read or even that pleasant of one, but it's just really good for downloading all of the ideas that are surrounding that industry into your head, and it will help inform the way you think about that whole kind of sphere. And it's interesting because it affects far more of like a lot of other industries that you might not consider. So again, I'm not like necessarily recommending this is a great book to sit down and read, but if you're interested in learning about that industry, this is a good way to do it.
I dig it, dog. Shall I recap?
Yeah, please recap.
All right, number 10, King Rat by James Something, either Vel or Vel. Number 9, Washington Black, Essie Adugian. Number 8, Fatherland, Robert Harris. Number 7, Olive Kitteridge, Elizabeth Strout. Number 6, The Moore's Account, Layla Lalami. Number 5, If Beale Street Could Talk, James Baldwin. Number 4, The Sisters Brothers, Patrick DeWitt. Number 3, Pachinko, Min Jin Lee. Number 2, The Silence of the Girls, Pat Barker. And number 1, Normal People, Sally Rooney. Your winner of the 2019 Mike Booker Prize.
The Mike Booker Prize. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Sally. I'm sure that will be right up on your mantle next to your many other prizes.
In her next book, it'll be in the inside jacket.
Most likely. Well reviewed by Top 10 with Kyle and Mike.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your literary adventures, Michael. Yeah. I always love these episodes, and you have filled me with zest. I will now read a book when we are done here.
Yeah, I love it. It's a happy thing. It's a happy thing. It's a fun thing to reflect on at the end of the year.
That's fun. I've got a similar year-end pod that we'll probably hopefully release next week. So I understand the fun of it. Yeah. All right. Go enjoy your day. I'm sorry I've taken so much of it.
We'll do. Well, let's talk about some things first.
Oh, yeah. I will say a big thank you to Kevin MacLeod for his
our best friend, who we've never met.
Disclaimer, we do not know Kevin MacLeod, who wafted us with Stank today in the Not Top 3 and the intro-outro music. He's fantastic. I will also say thank you to my sister, Erin, and her fantastic artistic stylings, which you can see in our artwork, or, of course, at Saint Design on Instagram.
Beautiful stuff, Kyle. I'd also like to thank our social media director / guru / czar, Caroline Labranti. Her stuff is now available on Instagram. I forget the thing, but it's CML Photography, I think, now.
Oh.
Yes. I don't know what we're going to do if and when she ever changes her last name. Maybe it becomes CMG, CLG, I don't know. We're going to find out. But her styling can be found on the internets. She does a great job for us on our Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. All those things are Top 10 KM. If you're thinking about our social medias, you want to shoot us an email because you want to tell us that normal people sucked butts, or it was great, or, whatever. Or we pronounced James Clavel's name wrong. Shoot us an email at top10km@gmail.com. The 10 is spelled out in that and all of our social media platforms. I'm sure you're listening to us on some form of podcast app. If you want another one, we are on Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Apple Podcast app. Pretty much wherever a person could find a podcast, that's where we are. So that is what I would say, dog.
I think that's all there is to say, good sir.
All right. Well, enjoy your Sunday, and I will talk to you soon.
Very good.
Peace.